And this is the Los Angeles Audit Committee. I'm the chair, accompanied by Mr. Blumenfield and Mr. Park. We can get started. Mr. Clerk, can you please read the first item
Yes, ma'am.
to the record?
Yes, ma'am. Item number 1 is Controller Report relative to the Cost Allocation Plan 35 for fiscal year 2012-2013.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Todd Bowie here and Lillian Sedlak with the Controller's Office. And the item before you is the final approved Cost Allocation Plan 35 rates as approved by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. These are being presented to you as the governing body as the final and approved rates, and this item is a note and file item.
Is there any questions?
Sure. Thank you, Madam Chair. Does the cost allocation plan contain significant variations from prior year's plans, and if so, why?
Lillian, would you like to?
Not in the last couple of years. We had some problems with 32 through 34 because of the highly reduced salaries that we had, so it made some swings. But overall, we've pretty much cleaned that up at this point.
So it's not a big variation.
It is. They are bigger for the smaller departments because it's their costs over their salaries. And so because they have a low salary base, if they have a higher cost, such as an internal audit, which gets charged to them, then that can cause a huge swing in their rate. But generally, the bigger departments, we haven't had any issues
so
with them.
The larger departments tend to be a little bit more stable than the smaller departments, who can be heavily influenced by significant increases or decreases relative to their budget. But overall, there is some variation here and there. Some of the rates have come down, I think, a little bit overall as a result of reduced overhead, essentially, in the city.
When do we get the cost allocation plan for this coming year?
For 36 has been with the feds since July 25th. They have to get funding to perform the audit, and they have not gotten funding yet. HHS is a contractor from HUD, who's our cognizant agency, and then we expect to send out 37 hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and we're working on 38 right now.
So the federal government experiences some delays sometimes with regard to their own funding, and so right now the agent for us in terms of reviewing auditing CAP, they have uncertainty as to when they're going to be under contract to continue to do so, so it is causing delay.
Does that impact us in any substantial way in terms of our operations and expectations about funding?
It can be inconvenient, but overall, I think in the scheme of things, CAP is designed such that eventually it true-ups to itself.
And most of the bigger departments, aging and community development, a lot of their stuff is direct billed, so they don't use the cap rates as much as maybe another department might use for interdepartmental billing. And by the time we get around to our billings, and it's a wash, because in a couple of years it'll be a little bit lower, a little bit higher. We never truly recover everything we can, just because we don't bill everything we can. So there is some swings that have been problems in the past, but we've been able to manipulate the rates.
And do our rates have any impact on our ability to get future grants in terms of our, bang for the dollar, bang per buck kind of thing? Or is it really independent? It's something that's negotiated, and it has nothing to do with whether or not we get down. Yeah, we're able to take grants down.
It tends to be based on the individual grants. Some grants have different caps in terms of how much they'll allow you to recover relative to overhead costs. So the rates themselves don't necessarily have an impact on our ability to receive grants, but the rates are necessary for billing purposes of the federal grants.
Great. Thank you.
Mr. Parks, do you have any questions?
No.
Okay, I have none either, so I don't have any cards on file, so we can move on to the next item.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Move to note and file this item. Thank you. Can you please read the next item into the record?
Yes, ma'am. Item number 2 is our controller reports relative to the audit of the Telecommunications Fund, Special Revenue Fund number 342.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Rick Degucci with the Controller's Office. So our audit of Fund 342 was issued in June of 2014. one reason why we decided to look at this fund was that we noted a large increase in the cash balance. So, for example, the cash balance as of the end of 2009 was $3 million, and by the end of 2013 it was about $29 million. So one objective of the audit was to determine the reason for the large increase in the balance. We also wanted to make sure that the funds were being properly accounted for. So just in the way of background, the city receives about $35 million in fees per year from 5 cable companies. Those are Time Warner, AT&T, Verizon, Cox, and Charter. About 95% is received from Time Warner and AT&T. And the city receives 2 major types of fees. One is called franchise fees, and the other is public, educational, and government, or PEG fees. So with respect to franchise fees, 5% of each cable company's applicable gross revenues are remitted to the city. And then in accordance with city regulations, 60% is deposited to the general fund and 40% is deposited to Fund 342. So with respect to the monies in Fund 342 that's derived from franchise fees, those monies are restricted to PEG programming and other telecommunication uses. In addition, upon approval of council and the mayor, monies can be transferred from Fund 342 to the general fund. And then with respect to PEG access fees, cable companies also pay 1% of their applicable gross revenues as PEG access fees. The city didn't begin collecting these fees until 2009. And these collections have more restrictions. They're restricted to capital expenditures to support PEG channel facilities. So overall, we found that ITA had properly recorded franchise and PEG access fees. So for example, that split was properly done between the 60% going to the general fund and the 40% going to Fund 342. So one thing that we learned was that the large increase was due to the collections of the PEG access fee that were not being spent. So as of June 30th, 2013, about $30 million had been collected, but only about $2.5 million had been spent. In April 2013, Council approved spending $1.3 million in design costs for constructing a new Channel 35 facility. The facility is expected to be completed in fiscal year 16-17 at a cost of about $19 to $23 million. But even with this large expenditure, by the end of 2017, with the new fees coming in, there should be a balance of approximately $21 to $25 million. And the audit had found that ITA had not updated its long-term plan to address how those monies would be used. So some of the other findings from the audit were that the monies are accounted for in the same fund. We believe that for transparency, it would be better to have 2 separate funds, one for the franchise fees and one for the PEG access fees. Therefore, at any point in time, it would be real easy to see the available balance and for each of those 2 collections. We also noted that there needed to be closer oversight over private franchise billings. So the department also bills 19 private businesses who use the city's public right-of-way for their internal communication cabling and facility needs. So we found that the franchise were not always billed timely. For example, in 2013, one franchise was billed $30,000 for periods dating back to 2004. And then lastly, we found that the department did not always cancel encumbrances timely. The timely cancellation of these encumbrances increases the unreserved fund balance, so it gives decision makers better information as to the available balance in that fund. So for example, during the audit, the department canceled $165,000 in encumbrances. We sampled 10 of these encumbrances and found that 9 of them could have been canceled much earlier. For example, for 4 of the encumbrances, the last payment to the vendor had been made about 3 years before the encumbrances were canceled. Recently, we received ITA's action plan. That was in August of 2014, and they indicated that several recommendations had already been implemented and that several others were in the process of being implemented. So with respect to the recommendations addressed to the ITA, we have accepted the department's reported statuses. Questions?
I have a couple, but did you guys?
I have some questions here as well.
Okay. So I have a question on recommendation 1 regarding the guidelines for the 1% PEG monies. Where are we in regards to the department establishing guidelines for the use of the PEGS money?
I think the department,
For the
I
PEG
don't know if
fee,
the city attorney's here also that can address that better probably than us.
Oh,
And can I add a point to
Yeah.
that, which is I have a motion that I put in July that's pending in ITGS that's specifically asking to come up with a series of recommendations on how that's to be done, and that's pending. And I think I'll turn it over to you and we can talk about it further.
yeah, that was going to be my last question. I think Mr. Parks and I signed on to that motion.
You did. You guys were both the same. So all three of us were part of that and care about that very issue. So.
So,
First of all, my name is William Imperial. Good afternoon, council members. And with me is Mike Dundas from the City Attorney's Office. So there's two issues that you're being asked us to address. The first, of course, is the guidelines and policies that the Controller's Office has asked ITA and the City Attorney to come up with. We asked for a March date of next year to respond fully with regard to that. And so we continue to work, I'll just let you know, we continue to work with establishing those guidelines, general guidelines, by the way, for policy and use of the 1% PEG fees. We're having internal discussions always going with regard to the use of those monies, especially because we're developing the budget plan for the new relocation of the studios, Channel 35 studios, and we'll be expending quite a bit of money. And with regard to that, I don't know if Mike has anything to add to that.
No, Mike Dundas, City Attorney's Office. Our office is in constant communication with ITA over the expenditure of these funds, and we give advice on a regular basis. With respect to specific guidelines, the law is constantly changing. In fact, as Councilmember Bloomfield knows, the city's involved with litigation against Time Warner, and that litigation itself, which is set for trial in April, could have an impact on the area of the law. In this case, it's not something that's been really tested so far to any great extent in the courts, and so it's a continuing process to update the department on what the latest state of the law is with respect to the expending of this money.
Go ahead.
I'm going to jump around. So on recommendations 4, it's my understanding after reading the report that you disagree with the recommendations. Can you explain why?
Is that the question of them?
With regard to,
Recommendation 4?
yes, there's two issues here with regard to the audits of the cable companies. It's been a long-standing problem because of
I'm sorry, no, recommendation 4 is on the audits of the cable companies.
Right. With regard to the audits of the cable companies, there's been an issue that has arisen with regard to the application of California law under the Digital Infrastructure and Video Competition Act that was passed by the legislature in 2006 and went into effect in 2007 and really impacted the city in 2008 when Time Warner Cable, which is the major provider of the city of Los Angeles, we believe about 80 to 85% of the subscribers are Time Warner Cable subscribers. That limits the city's ability to enforce timely, what would truly be considered timely responses to our audits. There is no legal teeth in that, and Mike can speak to that with regard to what DIVCA says, and I'll just stop right there, and I'll let him take over.
As William referenced, the city is in a position that it's at the will of the cable companies with respect to compliance with the audit. We can provide, if the committee is interested, for example, correspondence between the city and Time Warner with respect to the audit related to the years 2008 through 2011. It took a number of years for us to be able to get Time Warner to allow our auditors into the building to actually look at the records to be able to audit them in a timely manner. Since there is no provision that in the state law that requires the company to respond with any particular speed, we, or the department, has to go through the process of working with our office and getting tolling agreements, for example, to be able to extend our ability to actually take action on the results of the audit in the future. So the department works as quickly as it can to get the companies to comply, but we are, to be aware, at the company's mercy when it comes to actually getting into pulling out the file cabinets and seeing the records.
And they're currently going through a merger, right, with Comcast. How is that going to play out with what we're trying to, in terms of us having access to their information for purposes of our audit?
Well, here's my opinion, all right, and it's a very humble opinion that what we found, because I'm a member of the, and so is some of our staff members, member of the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors, where we are on an email list, and there's a law and policy committee as well. What we found, and what I'm getting from members that are attorneys and people in my position with regard to being telecommunications officers, that Comcast actually responds quite quickly to these audit responses, more so than Time Warner Cable. And that's been the experience, and I verified that before coming here today, with our auditors who also, our present auditors, who also audit both Time Warner Cable and Comcast. So that's maybe the good news if the approval by the FCC occurs on the merger, which it is anticipated that it will be later next year. But that it may be good news from the auditing perspective, but only time will tell. I'm hoping that that's the case.
Is there a way to work with the auditors to create oversight on how to deal with some of these cable companies?
Well, here's the rub, and even this occurred even before DIVCA, before the law was changed, is that the city had the authority to revoke the local franchises at one time for material misrepresentations and material breaches of the local franchise agreements. And that was our real bailiwick of being able to enforce the audits and the timely responses to the audits. So the only real mechanism that we have right now, other than litigation, which we can always threaten, is to threaten them that we are going to go into litigation. And what we do is we do an estimate based on the best evidence that we have or the best information that we have. And it's culled from wherever our auditors will cull it from. And they'll just call a number, and most often than not, the number's going to be incorrect. And that's the bad thing about going into litigation with that kind of an audit response. So we tend to work with the operators, because it does, by the way, at the end of the day, provide a better settlement with regard to these audits. We just closed, I'm happy to report, last week, and we expect to receive payment tomorrow, our audits with AT&T from October of 2009, when they first began operating in the city and paying fees, to December 31st, 2011. So we settled for about 95% of what we believe the underpayment was. So we got a good result on that one. Not a lot of money, by the way, but $245,000. And some of that money includes reimbursement for our auditors' costs, which is good. Not much, but it's something.
Do we currently charge a fee for any delay in compliance?
We're not able to under state law. It's as I said, we're sort of it's a process that has to take place, with a handshake. That they have to agree to give us the records before we can actually look at. Our auditors can look at them to determine whether or not there's been any underpayment. And as the council member, as William said, in the past there was always the threat of considering failure to allow compliance with the audit process to be a breach. But now, since it's a state franchise issued by the PUC, we don't have that authority anymore. So it's really just waiting and signing tolling agreements and the threat of litigation. Yeah.
On that point, so with DIFCA we lost the franchise hammer. Was there anything else in DIFCA that besides that, this basic notion of who's controlling the franchise that changed to make it more difficult to audit? And if so, is there something, the natural follow-up to that is there something that we should be pushing to have changed to give us a little bit more authority?
Well, I believe that the law at the state level could be strengthened to provide for a shorter time period on when these audits should be closed. Right now the statute of limitations on the collection of these audits is 3 years and 45 days. So the period normally of statute of limitations is around 4 to 6 years, depending on the group in California, depending on the classification of debt or obligation is owed. And the minimum is 4 usually. But so they cut us from 4, what we had in our local franchising agreements, to 3 years and 45 days. And everybody thought, oh, that's great. We got a shorter period for us to sue, and all it's done is provided for more time to extend these tolling agreements because everybody's under the gun. And as Mike said, we start these audits with non-disclosure agreements between our auditors and the cable companies because it's our auditors who really get to look at the books. We don't get to see the books, and there really is no reason for us to do these books because they're really reviews, franchise fee reviews, not audits, because our auditors do not certify what they found because they're independent of the cable operators. They're not employees of the operators where they would normally certify these audits. So the bottom line there is that the only thing that we could probably do is ask the state legislature to provide some teeth, and we could develop language that the council could support by way of resolution on legislation in working with others. I don't know that anybody has moved that far. And what you have to understand again is that being the second largest city in the nation and being the largest city in California, we have the most interest in protecting our position on these audits. Most of the public entities I deal with are very small, and their PEG fees are $50,000 a year that they're in terms of receipts, and maybe $250, and they're happy with that. But ours are close to $6 million. It's a big difference. And so, and franchise fees being $30 million, we're pretty close there too.
I think it would be worth it to at least. Probably wouldn't be that hard to develop that language to bring back to this committee, and then we can decide whether it makes sense to put on the legislative program. And if they're tweaking that anyway, that might be some, constructive information we can give to our legislative colleagues that could be helpful to the city. So, I'd like to add that into the motion as we're noting filing this, but to add that as a report back for some language. Not urgent, but I think that could be helpful.
And let me address the question that Councilmember Parks, Chief Parks, has raised before with the ITA directly. Even more than a few years ago, he asked us to develop the 5-year plan in 2008, and we finally got to it not only in 2008, but in 2011 with the concrete plan. We got caught up, ITA got caught up in the recession and everything else that was going on, staff cuts, et cetera. But the bottom line there is we came up with the relocation of Channel 35 for the use of these monies. We're looking at $23 million. It may be significantly more than what we're finding right now in looking at the plan.
I hope not.
If we use the money for what it's intended for. There are other things that we could do with City Hall that we had talked about in ITGS that would encumber this money. And then there's the mobile van and other things that will be presented in the report. We hope to have that report back to you in 30 days. And there, again, will be an issue of operating expenses.
Which report in 30 days?
We're talking about the 5-year plan. I wanted to address that because I left that hanging.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, because there's a lot of creative things we could do with that funding, potentially. Creative good things. I've heard everything from launching our own satellite to all sorts of things that we could do. Seriously.
No, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in fact, I have a lot of questions about the use of those funds. I'm a little reluctant to ask too much about it because of the litigation that's pending, and I don't want to create a legislative record that would in any way be negative for the city. What I'm thinking of doing, this issue's come before ITGS numerous times, is maybe doing a closed session update on the litigation, in ITGS to delve into that a little bit more in a way that wouldn't run us too close to the line on any of these things, because I'm just reluctant to ask too many questions because of that pending issue.
So I want to ask the question on what's the status of the Time Warner lawsuit.
Well,
You just said
yeah.
trial set for April of next year?
Trial set for April. We're currently in the pre-trial discovery phase.
But it looks like we're going to go to trial.
Well, it's at this point in time, we will have a better idea of whether or not we're going to go to trial after discovery is concluded. We're still just in the beginning process of exchanging records, and depositions will come in the weeks and the next couple months.
And if I may, I would ask that you, when you do schedule the closed session hearing, you do it concurrent with the presentation of the 5-year plan, because it would make sense to do it at that time.
Which is in 30 days.
Within 30 days. We still need to hopefully internally finalize it and then send it out to the other departments for their comments and then present it to ITGS. And if asked about budget and finance as well.
Yeah, I mean, that may be, just scheduling wise, it may actually not be so easy to do that
I know.
because of Veterans Day and then December and everything else, and I'm eager to get information about it, but I don't know that it would necessarily hurt to bifurcate that.
Okay,
And the plan you're referring to is the 5-year budget plan?
correct.
It is the budget.
Correct.
I had a question about that, too.
Mhm.
So you just answered it. I want, on recommendation 5 on the franchise billing, how far behind are we on the billing and collecting of franchise fees?
5 addresses, if I may, private line telecommunication franchises. These are not the cable operator franchises we've been discussing. Private line franchise telecommunication facility franchises are those which connect the building of a company to another building of a company using the public rights-of-way. In other words, in a street or an alleyway. So they run cable through conduit, through big tubing, in through the ground, and they go from one building to another. And right now we have 20 franchise holders that pay a certain amount of franchise fees to the city. It's a set amount. It's $2.50 per linear foot for aerial, and we're working with the new museum up here, the Broad Museum. It's called the Broad Collection, with establishing a new franchise for them. It's a very small facility. It's going to be up on the telephone lines, actually. It's the only aerial we're going to have in the city. But we'll probably get close to $787 a year, and those are the types of fees that we get. We don't generate millions out of those. The largest that we have is with USC, which is $256,000 a year. But they're the anomaly. Most of the fees are run in the area between $500 to $1,500 a year, and that's not a significant amount of money. In terms of how far behind we are in the building, I can tell you right now we're current. We just billed and sent out invoices in September. All have come back paid. So we're current right now. We have a few in renewal that we'll be going to ITGS with, hopefully in a big bunch in the next 30 to 45 days. And in the renewals, we'll be able to establish the continuance of those franchises. They last 10 years, by the way,
I
for
was
the most
going to
part.
ask, so are these renewals, have any of those expired already, or,
Yes,
okay,
yes, they've expired.
so
Yeah.
this is the renewal process?
Correct, yeah. They're supposed to advise the city, the franchise holders, these companies. For example, Kaiser, they're supposed to advise us a year before that they want to renew, and sometimes we drop the ball, or they drop the ball. We just start the process of you need to renew. And so they start that process, and that's where we're at with some of these companies.
Okay.
And that's why we did accept the recommendation of the controller on that. They were correct. We were behind.
Mr. Parks, do you have any questions?
Yes, I got a couple. One thing I was going to ask you is that, and again, I want to thank you. You came to us several years ago and forewarned us about what happens if the state took over the franchise, and everything you said came true. I mean, when they took us out of the loop, I think at one time we had the strongest process of overseeing cable, and they went to Sacramento and said they didn't want to be enforced by several jurisdictions differently, and so I think it was unanimous vote that came out like within 13 minutes, and they took it over, and all of those things have come to pass if we have no control, nor do we have the ability to audit or anything else. And certainly the lever we had at one time where we could actually take your franchise is gone away forever. So I don't know whether there be people there willing to tweak the language to give you more access because it was such an overwhelming vote to disassemble every city's process and bring it up to the state. The one thing I was going to ask you on the USC, that's finally done, because I know it took us about 5 years to get. Did we go retroactively on that, or was that starting from the day they signed their new 10-year agreement?
Well, thankfully, they had agreed when we started the renewal process back in 2008, and because it expired in 2009, they had agreed in 2008 to make it retroactive with what we agreed to. So we did receive the payment for the retroactive fees as well as what the renewal was going to start with.
And colleagues, the reason that there's such a jump in the amount of that fee, somewhere down the line, 10 years ago or wherever, someone cut a sweetheart deal with SC to charge them, $500 an opening as opposed to the linear feet of the wiring. And when you actually, even with a discount, looking at linear feet, it jumped to 250,000. If you went strictly by linear feet and gave with no discount, it would be significantly higher. And so I think that was a major improvement. The other thing, and I appreciate you mentioned about the 5-year plan, because I think once you get rolling on that with that 1%, there are a variety of things that people are concerned about that are in city clerk's office and a variety of places that are part of our public access infrastructure that should not have to wait for the annual budget. There should be funds available to fix those things, and often if our internet or our homepage goes down, we can't wait to next year's budget to say, can we fix it? It's got to be on the fly. And so I think that 5-year plan is certainly something I've been looking forward to on that. The other issue that I think, hopefully at some point, and Mr. Blumenfield, maybe you could take the lead on this, that 40-60% split, that's just basically came out of the air in the sense of the city. There's no law that requires it. And one of the things I think that's harmful to the overall running of ITA is that they should be getting a larger allocation of those funds, of that franchise fees, which would take some of their operation off the budget. It's also, I believe, somewhat unfair for them to give up 60% of their franchise fees and then reimburse the city for a variety of things that the city says they're providing for them. So they're paying the city back their overhead and a variety of things, which basically takes even more money out of the 40% that they receive. So I think they're being treated unfairly, particularly under the when we had a very low years as far as dollars, that the CAO was looking for funds in any fashion they can get them, but to take 60% of their franchise money, which they rely on, and then make them pay overhead for paybacks, just as a double dip. And so it keeps them actually in a pauper state. They cannot really perform what we need to have performed if we keep taking their money. And so I think that's an area that I'd hope that we begin to look at, and with the 5-year plan, that we have an equal 5-year plan on the franchise fees, so that you can begin to look at over time how the department can have some self-sufficiency, and hopefully during the budget that we have some council members that go at arm's distance to push the CAO back about those paybacks. If you're going to take 60% of their money, why are you making them pay paybacks, or why don't you include the paybacks as part of the 60%? But don't do both. And I think that's something that needs to be done.
Well, speaking on behalf of ITA, even though my executive officer behind might come back and hit me in the back of the head.
He's just smiling.
Well, then I would go forward and say, thank you for your comments. We appreciate those. We support them. Thank you.
Okay.
So we just gave Mr. Blumenfield a job.
Should I duck?
right?
We just gave your dream job. Do you have any other questions? That's it? Okay. So thank you. I do have a couple of instructions. So if there's no objection, Mr. Clerk, I'd like to note and file the audit and the controller's report and request that the city attorney, with the assistance of ITA, draft an ordinance establishing a special revenue fund to separately account for the 1% PEG access fee, revenues and expenses, and include a provision that interest earnings be retained in the fund. And also instruct ITA to reconcile all sources and uses of the restricted 1% PEG access fee to determine actual monies on hand to support an appropriate balance transfer to the new special revenue fund when the ordinance is presented in council. And the last thing, which is not the last thing because I want to include what you said earlier, is that I also recommend that this item be moved to council at the same time as the ordinance that is currently sitting in ITGS. That's your motion.
Sounds good.
Okay. Do you want to include
Yeah,
that we come up with language?
Yeah, reporting back on language that we would include in our state legislative program to create more authority for audits in the future for this fund.
Thank you.
I had one just to asked if we could have I just caught it with the real name, ITGS, to, along with Budget Finance Committee, to reevaluate the 60-40 split and to ask ITA to create a 5-year plan for the franchise fee funding. And the third thing is ask that as we reevaluate the 60-40 split, that we ask that we make an effort to have IT pay their overhead paybacks out of their 60% as opposed to out of their 40%. So they're not being double billed.
We're all good with that?
Second that.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's approved. Oh, I don't see any cards for general public comment.
None.
So this concludes the Audits Committee. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.